So this video is part 2 in an ongoing series of videos where I talk about everything that comes to mind about every anime that I've seen, in the order that I watched them. For the most part, I won't include any massive spoilers, and if I want to talk about any specific plot events, I'll give you a decently long warning. So let's just start off straight away with the 11th anime I ever saw, all the way back in November of 2017. Dragon Ball GT is an anime original direct sequel to Dragon Ball Z, picking up with Goku and Oob training at the lookout after they fly away at the end of Dragon Ball Z. Similar to what I mentioned in the Dragon Ball Super section of the Part 1 video, a lot of my GT reflections are plot related, so if you really want to avoid spoilers, then skip this section of the video. Having recently subscribed to the Funimation streaming service to watch My Hero Academia and Gamers while I was in Canada, the next impulse watch was Dragon Ball GT. It was something I had only seen as a kid and had quite blurry memories and mixed feelings about, and was interested to see how well it held up all these years later. When I think to my memories of GT as a kid, I feel a weird sense of almost fear, but not quite fear. Probably a bit closer to eeriness. It's really hard to describe. I think it stems from the music that was used in the original Funimation dub of GT, which I'm using as the background music for this section of the video for reference. It always felt so serious and intense, and more importantly, drastically different from the Falconer score in Dragon Ball Z. More so than any of the content of the show, the feeling that this music left me with is what stuck with me about Dragon Ball GT after all these years. But looking back, I kind of respect the show for leaving me with such a distinct feeling. But anyway, fast forwarding to about 13 years later to 2017, and I decided it was time to give it a rewatch. And honestly, it was pretty great. So to start off, there was a new opening song in Dan Dan that I loved, and despite loving the original Step Into the Grand Tour opening, this new one set a much more pleasant tone for the show, the first step back from the serious and intense tone that still plagues my memories to this day. Concerning the visuals, GT basically mimics Dragon Ball Z's art style perfectly, and I absolutely love all the new character designs. Particular standouts were Baby Vegeta, Super Android 17, Nova Shenron, Sin Shenron, and perhaps what Dragon Ball GT is most famous for, and perhaps even the best part about Dragon Ball GT, which is Super Saiyan 4 Goku and Vegeta. They're easily my favourite Super Saiyan designs in the entire Dragon Ball universe. But anyway, in regard to the story arcs, some were definitely better than others. The initial few episodes where we catch up with Goku and Oob and meet an older Pan are really sweet. I always thought it was awesome how Goku was somewhat passing on the torch to Oob, and it was really cool seeing little Pan grown up and just living her life as a teenager. Then we transitioned to the Black Star Dragon Ball arc, which was the lowest point of the show for me. The crew travels to different planets in a quest to locate the Black Star Dragon Balls, but most of these planets are quite forgettable, and there's nothing really interesting that happens in this arc that really stands out. But despite that, it was fun to explore the Dragon Ball universe more than we ever have before. Goku, Trunks, and Pan made an interesting team to follow. I am aware that there's a lot of hate for GT Pan in the Dragon Ball community, but honestly, I had no problems with her at all. Maybe this is inaccurate since it has been a while since I saw GT, but I remember her being bossy, stubborn, and sometimes whiny, but rather than being traits that make me hate her, I find them cutely endearing. It makes her feel like an authentic teenage version of the baby Pan we saw at the end of Dragon Ball Z. But back to the main crew, we also eventually get the addition of Giru, who I absolutely love. He's hilarious and has a cute design. Next up, we get the Baby arc, which follows the typical big bad villain Dragon Ball Z arc style. But this is the creepiest Dragon Ball has ever been, with a parasite taking over the bodies of the Z fighters. I thought this arc was great. It had a unique villain gimmick that hadn't been explored in the Dragon Ball universe before. Its fights felt like they had high stakes, and it broke new ground with the introduction of the Golden Great Ape and Goku's Super Saiyan 4 transformation. The Golden Great Ape in particular is such a cool idea to me. It's the first time we see someone who can go Super Saiyan turn into their Great Ape form. And it turns out they don't just turn into a normal Great Ape, but a Golden Great Ape. It's such a great twist on the basic form, probably to sell more toys or something, but to me it introduces some subtle new lore and I love it. And of course there's Super Saiyan 4, which is great because it looks cool, talks cool, and feels very powerful. It's the most distinct Super Saiyan transformation in the entire series to date, and it was a neat way to bring back the adult form of Goku to the show. We then get the Super Android 17 arc, which I also love. I could be wrong about some of the details, but basically 2 scientists create a copy of Android 17 in Hell, which then works with the Android 17 who is not in Hell to break them all out of Hell. The 2 17s then merge into a singular Super Android 17, who is more powerful than even Super Saiyan 4 Goku. So Android 17 is the villain I find the scariest in all of the Dragon Ball universe, possibly second only to Android 19, who sucked up Goku's energy using his hand bead thing. But anyway, I like this arc quite a lot. I think its short length of 7 episodes worked well for it. Super Android 17 felt like a sudden scary threat who briefly rivaled Goku's new transformation. He had a subtly different and scary new design, had a cool ability in his infinite energy absorbing barrier that feeds him even more power as the fight drags on, and had a neat ending with Android 18 getting through to him on an emotional level, and Goku using Dragon Fist for the first time outside the DBZ movies. It was an interesting short arc. Then we finished GT with the Shadow Dragon arc. The early part was pretty lackluster. I honestly don't remember that much from it, but then we get to the Nova and Ice Shenron fights, and the arc really soared from there. Nova was the 4-star dragon and wasn't really a bad guy at all. Ice blinded Goku, Sin killed one of his fellow dragons, Vegeta turned Super Saiyan 4, Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta one-sidedly demolishes Omega Shenron, so many fun and interesting things happen, and it's practically all I could ever want from the show. So now there's the elephant in the room that is Dragon Ball Super. It doesn't really overwrite anything that happens in GT, but it's certainly difficult to explain why the characters in GT never mention any of the stuff that happened in Dragon Ball Super. Due to growing up with GT and just being way more invested in GT than Super, in my mind and personal canon, the events of GT are the true events that take place with Goku and his friends post-DBZ, with Super just being a fun, non-canon series in my mind. I probably had more fun watching Super, but in terms of engagement and interest in the story, GT is the undeniable winner. So by this point, you could probably tell that I have a lot of thoughts about GT. It's already been almost 5 years since my second watch, so I hope to rewatch it again soon, and hopefully make some more in-depth videos about it. 2 samurai and a young waitress search Edo period Japan for a samurai who smells of sunflowers. Samurai Champloo is fantastic. It has everything you could want from an anime's production, which is to be expected from the man who directed Cowboy Bebop. It has gorgeous art and top-tier animation, with unique use of great music and fantastic voice acting in the dub. It has stellar action, memorable characters, and tells engaging stories. At times it's hilarious, at times it's got you on the edge of your seat, and at times it's got your heart in the palm of its hand. The OP is visually simple but distinct, and the song is unique and catchy. So putting all those superlatives aside, I believe Samurai Champloo was the first anime I watched on the Anime Lab streaming service. I was really impressed with how well the app navigated compared to the terrible Funimation app that was the only thing I had experience to compare against. I watched the dub, and as usual it was great. This is definitely up there as one of the best dubs I've ever seen. The first thing I noticed when watching was just how crisp the show looked. I was shocked to find out that it came out all the way back in 2004, because it looked and felt so modern. In regard to the content of the show, I believe the series is made by the 3 main characters. Jin, a calm, rigid, methodical samurai. Mugen, his complete opposite, an unruly, wild, hot-headed samurai. And Fu, a clumsy, sister-like, often damsel in distress. These 3 characters carry the show, and their dynamic is probably my favourite aspect of Samurai Champloo. However, something that truly transcends the show is one particular scene which I still go back and watch every now and then, all these years later. It's the scene of Mugen slowly approaching the couple with the drums blasting as the background music. It's such a bold use of music and really demonstrates how the music of the show is truly integral to its storytelling. I would love to see more shows take a little of this boldness and use striking, loud, overpowering music to depict the emotions of those involved in what would otherwise be very subdued scenes. The show also had a fantastic finale. I don't remember the details of what made it so great, but I do remember being on the verge of tears and thinking it was one of my favourite endings to any series I had ever seen. For a long time, Samurai Champloo was actually one of 4 10 out of 10s on my personal My Anime list, but eventually I had to drop it down to a 9 due to my memory of the show fading over time. I've slowly began to forget what made the show so perfect in my eyes, but I think all that means is that it's finally time for a rewatch. So overall, Samurai Champloo was a breath of fresh air. It was visually crisp, had fantastic characters, and ended very strongly. A small lab in Akihabara accidentally stumbles into creating time travel. Steins Gate follows this group of young adults as they maneuver the consequences of their discovery. This was a period of time where I looked to the top of the My Anime List website to choose things to watch, and at the time, Steins Gate was all the way up in the 3rd or 4th spot. But similar to Cowboy Bebop, while watching it, I never really understood why it was so highly regarded. Don't get me wrong, I loved watching it, but it didn't feel extraordinarily special in any way. But the instant I finished watching it, I understood that it definitely was something special, since I immediately felt sad that I would never see these characters again. The show left me with the strongest post-series depression I had had up to that point, and probably still remains the winner to this day. You would think a show about time travel would be made by its mystery and execution of science fiction concepts, but to me, Steins Gate is made by being a small-scale character study, with time travel just being a plot device to thoroughly explore the characters, or I suppose you could argue just one character in particular. Over the course of the series, we see the deconstruction of a seemingly eccentric, optimistic young man who is forced to navigate a difficult world, and to this day, he remains my favorite anime character of all time. Visually, the show is very unique. I have no idea how to properly describe it, but the show looks very bright, like the summer sun is blazing down onto every scene, which is accentuated by the cicadas that are seemingly chirping away at all times. It's not the most sakuga-filled anime, but it certainly has moments of standout animation, and to me, the art style is great. The OP is also great. The visuals aren't really my cup of tea, but the song alone is an all-timer. Considering that Steins Gate is known for being a time travel show, I should probably also mention that the time travel aspect is done very well. It takes an interesting approach to the rules and methods of traveling, and it also has a really interesting first episode, which is a great mystery box. In 2021, I rewatched it, and it was even better the second time. One particular thing that stood out to me was a speech that Okabe gave toward the end of the series, which is perhaps my favorite character moment of all time, and my favorite piece of voice acting I have ever seen. It's arguably the climax of the deconstruction of his character, and it's up there as one of my favorite scenes of all time. So if you find time travel stories interesting, I'd recommend Steins Gate very highly. If you like a story that puts its characters at the forefront, then to me it's essential viewing. Steins Gate is pretty much a 10, and I would have absolutely no problem with placing it in my top 3 anime of all time, if not for my even greater love for its sequel, which I'll be talking about later in this video. Taking place in a world more dangerous than our own, Hunter x Hunter follows the adventures of Gon as he attempts to understand why his father left him to be a hunter. This show is fantastic from beginning to end. It's long-lasting with 148 episodes and maintains and arguably improves its production quality over its whole run. And what a long run it is. This was the longest anime I had seen up to this point, with the next longest being Dragon Ball Super at 104 episodes since I watched the movies instead of Super's first 2 arcs. It took me pretty much exactly a month to finish it, spanning multiple countries since I distinctly remember watching the early Palace Invasion episodes in my hotel room during a holiday in Japan. But I was hooked to Hunter x Hunter all the way back in episode 4. This is a uniquely Hunter x Hunter episode that takes place almost entirely in a plain underground tunnel, with the characters running a marathon the entire episode. The point of the episode was just to get to know the characters, and it's so uniquely interesting. By all accounts it should be boring. It's the complete opposite of show don't tell, but for some reason it thoroughly engaged me from beginning to end, and I knew that Hunter x Hunter was going to become something special. Which of course it eventually did, because even to this day it sits comfortably in my top 3 anime of all time. But this brings me to face the question of what it is about Hunter x Hunter that I liked so much. Pretty much anything you can name, Hunter x Hunter nails it in my opinion. There's great characters who have interesting interactions, it takes place in an interesting world, and there's a lot of fun and emotional fights, and of course the art, animation, music and voice acting is all stellar. But what elevates the show so highly for me is just how engaged I am when watching it. The show always fully captures my attention, and episodes fly by in no time at all. And for me, this is something quite unique to Hunter x Hunter, especially for a show that's as long as Hunter x Hunter is. It's impossible for me to pin down what it is about the show that creates this engagement in me, beyond saying it's some special Hunter x Hunter factor. But anyway, moving on from all that meaningless rambling, let me fire through some more concrete opinions on the show. The OP is great, but the first version of the song is the best one. All of the EDs are great. I know everyone loves the Phantom Troop ED, but the Chimera Ant one is the best one by far. and the way it's played behind the narrator's dialogue in certain episode endings is just perfection. Nen is a fun power system, but it doesn't really make or break the show. It's just another interesting aspect of the world. And there are no weak arcs. Every arc is fantastic, and they all feel really distinct, which is neat, and it keeps the show fresh. Now, I could talk about Hunter x Hunter all day, but there's two things that I definitely need to talk about before I end this section of the video. The first is the Gon Hisoka fight in Heaven's Arena. I just want to comment on how genius it was to place this fight at the end of an episode. You get the introduction of the two fighters with the perfect episode stopping point as they walk toward each other, with the commentator announcing that this is the big fight we've been waiting for. But the episode doesn't stop, and the fight actually starts. Every second we get of the fight feels like borrowed time, and it's absolutely exhilarating and places me on the edge of my seat. It's a fantastic subversion of what would usually be a cliffhanger, and feeds into making the fight itself even more intense, and I love it. Now, the second and final thing I have to talk about is the Chimera Ant arc. It's my favourite story arc of all time. Whether anime, live action TV shows, movies, you name it, and to this day, the Chimera Ant arc tops the list. It has everything I love about storytelling. It has characters and relationships being pushed to their limits, really interesting character interactions, fist-pumping successes, and heart-wrenching failures. The fights are incredibly slow-paced and focus on characters and ideologies rather than choreography. We meet so many interesting characters and face a few subversive interactions. From a production standpoint, art, animation, directing, voice acting, music, you name it, and the Chimera Ant arc nails it. It's thought-provoking, tear-jerking, and thoroughly engaging. And that's all without even mentioning the key antagonist, who is a really interesting, subversive character through which the story explores a variety of existential questions. And I'm also a massive Neferpito simp. She's great too. So overall, if you haven't already, just go and watch Hunter x Hunter. It's one of my 3 favorite anime of all time, and has my favorite story arc in all of fiction. In a world where the Holy Britannian Empire has subjugated Japan and renamed it to Area 11, a lone high school student embarks on a daunting journey in pursuit of knowledge and revolution. Code Geass was a fun watch. It wasn't particularly revolutionary in its storytelling or anything, but the story itself was decently interesting, and the show was full of a bunch of fun scenes and had an amazing dub. The only dub voice I wasn't a fan of initially was Nunnally's, but it grew on me by the end of the show, and I actually like it quite a bit now. The show is centered around Lelouch, who is incredibly fun to watch and might have the best dub voice of all time. He's a melodramatic main lead whose actions and way of presenting himself are absolutely full of bravado. I don't think he's the deepest character or anything, but this bravado combined with his fantastic voice compensate for any shortcomings in terms of depth. If I like a character because I enjoy watching them, then there are very few characters I like more than Lelouch. His strategies are fun to watch in a similar vein to Light Yagami's from Death Note. But the Death Note comparisons end there, because these are two wildly different shows. Death Note is subdued and tonally focused, while Code Geass is extravagant and tonally inconsistent. In one scene you could focus on an intense depiction of domestic terrorism, and then immediately transition to a scene of a high school student council, where they're planning a pizza party to boost student morale. It's certainly an eccentric choice by the series director, and I'm sure that it probably puts a lot of people off, but I find it entertaining rather than annoying. I have 2 main criticisms of Code Geass. The first is the strange transition from Season 1 to 2. It's been a while since I watched the show, so I can't explain it in great detail, but I remember feeling that the beginning of Season 2 didn't flow well at all from the finale of Season 1. I remember Season 1 building to a climactic cliffhanger, and then Season 2 not following it up at all and choosing to go in a very different direction. Now, I thought Season 2 as a whole was great, but this transition was a little bit weird. My second piece of criticism is that Code Geass is a mecha anime, and I have basically zero interest in mechs. Hence, a lot of the action didn't really do it for me. The show does this cool money-saving trick where they depict large-scale destruction by having dots marked enemy blip out on a screen, and I love that, but whenever there was actual mech-to-mech action, I never found it interesting at all. Fortunately, a lot of the action scenes also have back and forth dialogue between the fighters, and maybe it's just because I love the dub so much, but to me, dialogue is one of Code Geass' strengths, so it makes the otherwise disinteresting mecha fights much more bearable. Code Geass has a bunch of fun and fantastic scenes that I love to go back and rewatch every now and then. For instance, Kid Lelouch seeking an audience with the Emperor's "all men are not created equal" speech, Lelouch's command to Euphemia, Schneisel's introduction at Kamine Island, the chess match, Lelouch's speech in the throne room, his final conversation with Schneisel, his speech to the world, and of course the best scene in the show, which is the final scene before the epilogue. Now, there's a few somewhat random things I want to mention. The first and the fifth openings are great, but I don't care for the rest at all. The vocals in the first 10 seconds of the fifth opening in particular have this distinct sound to them that I can't describe, but I love it. It's kind of similar to the first 10 seconds of My Hero Academia's first opening. I know how vague that sounds, but if there's anyone out there who in any way relates to this, you have to tell me. I've been dying to find a way to describe this, but I'm just so illiterate when it comes to describing music. Anyway, besides the inconsistent OPs, the soundtrack is consistently great. In regard to the art, the long-limbed character designs are weird and there's some funny memes, but in reality it doesn't bother me at all. And finally, Super Electromagnetic Shrapnel Cannon Voltage Confirmed is one of the most ridiculous over-the-top lines ever, and it fits perfectly in line with the show, and I love it. So to wrap it up, I want to mention 2 episodes that are notable standouts to me and probably transcend the show. The first is the episode Blood-Stained Yuffie. The episode evoked a visceral feeling of shock in me, and executes such a bold and heartbreaking twist that I love. The second is the final episode. It's probably the best episode of the show, and it made me cry, which is not something I was expecting from Code Geass. But boy oh boy does the ED ruin the ending of that fantastic episode. The final scene ends with this soft, sad, but optimistic music, and then transitions into the usual ED, which is obnoxiously loud and energetic, and doesn't match the soft tone of the ending at all. Letting the credits roll at the end of an episode is one of the hallmarks of a good episode ending for me, and boy did I skip those credits immediately. But anyway, Code Geass was a very fun show, with a protagonist that was incredibly entertaining to watch. It's not perfect, but its highs are really high, and I would definitely recommend it to almost anyone. In an alternate timeline following the events of Steins Gate, a depressed Okabe struggles to move on from his loss. Steins Gate Zero is up there with Hunter x Hunter and another yet-to-be-named anime in my current favourite 3 anime of all time. If you haven't seen the original Steins Gate, skip this section of the video, because I'm going to be spoiling it. But let's start with some meta stuff. A few weeks after finishing Steins Gate, I saw on Anime Lab that a sequel had begun airing called Steins Gate Zero. So I decided to wait for the show to finish airing before watching it, so that I didn't have to pay for Anime Lab for any longer than I had to. As the season went on, I was very much looking forward to watching it, as Steins Gate Zero jumped pretty quickly into the top 10 anime of all time on the MyAnimeList website. Now I'm going to try and explain why I love Steins Gate Zero so much, but in order to do so, you have to understand what kind of stories are truly special to me. I love stories that capture my heart and make me feel strong emotions, and Steins Gate Zero made me cry tears of both sadness and pure joy. The emotions I felt watching Steins Gate Zero dwarfed those I felt watching the original series. But this is only the case because it builds on the amazing foundation that the original series constructed. In Steins Gate, we see a kind young man forced to face what seems like insurmountable hopelessness, but in the end, he prevails at overcoming it. In Steins Gate Zero, we follow the same man in a world where he did not prevail, and this sense of hopelessness consumed him. Knowing the person he was at the beginning of Steins Gate, and knowing just how close he was to living a better, happier life, makes his sad situation even sadder. Now I could give a breakdown of the show and give a criticism of what works so well and what doesn't in the story of Steins Gate Zero, but it's really not worth it, because that's not why I love it so much. It purely comes down to the strong emotions it evokes within me. Before I jump into some spoilery stuff, I want to mention a few things. The first is one particularly brilliant use of music. Believe Me is perhaps the most memorable theme from Steins Gate, and Steins Gate Zero has this one track it plays quite a bit, which sounds just like Believe Me, but the peak of the song is never quite reached, and instead the same few notes are repeated with lower and sadder sounding tones. Again, I suck at describing music, but I'll link the 2 parts of these songs that I'm talking about in the description, and hopefully you'll see what I mean. The other thing I want to mention is that Steins Gate Zero's OP is just so great. The visuals are so much better than the original OP in my opinion, and the same can be said about the song. On top of that, Steins Gate Zero also has a far superior ED in Last Game that just fits the show so perfectly. It's not my favourite ED of all time or anything, but it may be one of the best matched EDs for an anime I've ever seen. I should also mention that I rewatched Steins Gate Zero in 2021. I was interested to see if this held up as the better Steins Gate, since I heard there's some people out there who like it much less than the original, and as you can probably expect from the praises I've been singing, it certainly held up. Now before I end, there's a few scenes in particular I want to briefly talk about. This will spoil the entire show, including the ending, so if you haven't seen it, then skip to the next anime in this video. I tried writing a version of this script where I was as vague as possible, and it was terrible. So here we are with a massive spoiler warning, which is ending right now. So there's so many scenes I'd like to rave about, but there's 4 in particular that are essential. The first is when Mayuri's watch stops working. I had such an unbelievably visceral and memorable shock of adrenaline run through me when it happened. It felt like everything that Okabe had done in Steins Gate, and all the pain and sadness he had been through, all for the sake of Mayuri, had all been for nothing. It really got to me so suddenly and strongly, and it put me exactly in Okabe's position for a second, and it was so utterly perfect. The next scene that requires me to talk about it is Hoin Kyoma's return. To the best of my memory, this is the first time I've cried out of sheer happiness. The deeper the sadness I witness in a story, the more joy I feel when that sadness is finally overcome. And boy was Okabe's terrible life so deeply sad, and his overcoming it so goddamn joyous. The next standout scene is the final Operation Arclight scene. The music is phenomenal and makes me tear up every time. We've had this scene play out so many times, and this is the one time everything will work out, and the music really makes you feel it. It's the climax of the show, and Okabe referring to Mayuri as Lab Member 002 to show her that he's finally taken a step beyond his depression is such a fantastic way to end the series. Now the final scene I need to talk about is Mayuri slapping Okabe, the Steins Gate opening music playing, and all the dialogue being cut off, because the dialogue doesn't matter. It's a brilliant directing choice and forces tears to shed from my eyes. I love this scene so much, and it doesn't stop there. We then transition directly to Steins Gate Zero Okabe recording a message for his past self, the same message we see at the end of Steins Gate, and it's revealed that it was a melodramatic, highly produced, homemade movie with all of his friends helping out. It's just such an amazing subversion of something we hadn't even questioned from the original series, and it just feels so natural. There's plenty more scenes to talk about, but those are the 4 most important that I just had to include in this short section of a longer video. Overall, Steins Gate Zero is one of my 3 favorite anime of all time, and it's one of the most emotionally impactful stories I've ever watched. Sold at an auction to a large man with an animal skull for a head, Chise is thrust into a world more magical than she could have ever imagined. Having already paid for a month of Anime Lab to watch Steins Gate Zero, I thought I may as well make good use of my money and watch something else as well. And boy oh boy were they promoting the ancient Magus' bride on the front page of the Anime Lab app for a long time. So I decided to give it a watch. Looking back at how many anime I've watched simply because they were promoted by the streaming service I was using at the time shows just how effective these promotions are on me, which is pretty funny to think about in retrospect. But anyway, I don't have too much to say about the ancient Magus' bride. It was a perfectly fine show taking place in a cute little magical world. I don't remember too much about the story, but I vaguely remember it was a love story between an ancient demon and a teenage girl. In retrospect, this seems kind of weird to me, but I don't remember having any mixed feelings when watching it, so I'll reserve commenting on the story until I rewatch it one day. But the story wasn't really what stood out to me about the show anyway. It was just the general pleasant vibe. It felt like I was watching one of those nature landscape videos they play on OLED TVs in a store for a world a little more magical than our own. There were a few darker moments, but overall it just felt like an exploration of a subtly magical world. Maybe you think that's a pretty vague description, but to be honest, I don't remember too much from the show. I just remember the general vibe it left me with. There's only 3 characters I really remember. Chise, the protagonist, who was a kind but sad teenage girl. Elias, Chise's owner, who was similarly kind but had a dark past that he didn't remember. And this one magic guy with blonde hair who was in charge of dragons or something, and he sung a song at one point. I like these characters, and I don't really remember many plot events concerning them, but I do feel like I remember what kind of people they were pretty well. But enough of me trying to vaguely describe things I liked about a show that I hardly remember. Let me instead mention 2 related things that I absolutely do remember. The first is the opening song. This is an absolute all-timer. I get goosebumps listening to the climax of it. And we get this played in the anime itself when Chise turns into a flame phoenix or something and flies home to Elias. I don't remember much about the context, but that scene of her flying and the way the music stops but the vocals keep going when she's at the apex of her flight is just 10 out of 10 stuff. But really, that's all I have to say about the ancient Magus' bride. It was a cute little show set in a cute little world with cute little characters. It wasn't too impactful or anything, and I don't remember too much about it, but there's enough there, and it feels unique enough that I could definitely see it being many people's favorite anime. The Promised Neverland follows the lives of a bunch of young kids in pursuit of finally leaving the orphanage that had been their home essentially since birth. This is an anime I watched week to week as it exploded in popularity back in February of 2019. I actually initially heard about it because Mr. Beast tweeted about it. Not that I used to use Twitter or was even a fan of Mr. Beast or anything. I think he might have been a guest on a podcast I regularly listened to or something, and he probably mentioned his tweet. But anyway, this was a fantastic anime. If you want to go in completely fresh, which I recommend, then go and watch it and skip this part of the video before I end this sentence, because I do want to talk about some mild spoilers. It's only 12 episodes, so it won't take you very long, and I highly recommend it. So with that preface out of the way, not that I've seen many Prison Break stories or anything, but The Promised Neverland Season 1 is definitely my favourite one. It's crazy how good this anime was, and it's wild to consider its sheer popularity considering that its first season was only 12 episodes long. It has great elements of mystery, suspense, horror, drama, and science fiction, and it wastes absolutely no time with fantastic pacing. The main trio of characters are memorable and lovable, and the main antagonist is equally frightening and compelling. The production is also fantastic. I don't recall if this is one shot or just every shot in the hallways of the orphanage, but there's this really creepy use of CGI as the characters are going downstairs or through the hallways that's just so effective at establishing a suspenseful and scary atmosphere. The show also has fantastic music, but Isabella's Lullaby is definitely the standout track that I've listened to on loop for hours on end. It's definitely the song I'll be putting as the background section for this part of the video. The OP is also great. It's my favourite song to play on Beat Saber. But that's all my generic praise for the show out of the way. Go and watch it. It's only 12 episodes and it will fly by like nothing. So when season 1 ended, I went straight to binging the manga, and honestly, for how drastic of a shift the story takes after the season 1 storyline, the manga does a pretty damn good job of following it up. I found the manga very enjoyable up until around the final arc, which felt a bit messy and didn't contain much cleverness or anything that spoke to me emotionally or anything. To me, the content covered by the anime is probably like an 8, and the remainder of the manga is around a 7, with some moments that definitely reach the peaks of season 1. But the ending is probably around a 5 or 6. In terms of season 2, I've only seen the first episode, but the manga's lackluster ending really sapped any motivation I had to continue watching. I also heard that they skipped what was probably my favourite manga arc, so honestly I'm not really keen to watch it at all. But overall, of the one season I have seen, I definitely recommend watching The Promised Neverland. It's a fantastic 12 episode long story which engaged me from beginning to end. A middle-aged Japanese man reincarnates as the weakest life form in a fantastical world. That time I got reincarnated as a slime was my first isekai, so it has a special place in my heart. I first heard about it by seeing the consistently highly upvoted discussion posts on the r/anime subreddit when season 1 was airing, so I decided to give it a watch. And boy was it just plain fun to watch. In my mind, any pseudo-objective criticism is just meaningless because I just love watching every episode, and the show was so fun from beginning to end. It doesn't quite make it into my favourite 3 anime of all time, but it's undeniably one of around 5 personal 10 out of 10s that I've seen. The first thing I remember thinking was just how fun it was to see Rimuru getting stronger so quickly in the series, as though he's leveling up like he's in an RPG. As the series goes on, he gets a bunch of cool abilities and techniques, and it really feels like we're watching someone live out their life in an RPG. It even has the right soundtrack to go along with it. It's just so fun to watch. Besides Rimuru, who is definitely my favourite character in the show, the side characters are a good time. It's not like they're the deepest characters in the world or anything, but I enjoy watching them, and scenes centered around them aren't boring like they can be in other shows. This is kind of why Slime Diaries works so well as a spin-off series, but more on that in a future video. Of course, Rimuru is the most entertaining character to watch, but taking time away from him doesn't invoke a feeling of why are we watching this side story, can't we go back to Rimuru, which is something that definitely happens in other shows. I enjoy pretty much every character, and this show definitely has a lot of them. I was planning to list my 5 favourite characters, excluding Rimuru of course, but it's impossible to narrow it down to a top 5. There's Veldora, Ranga, the Goblins, the Ogres, Gabiru, every single Demon Lord, Ramidis, Kaijin, Diablo, the Dwarf King, Great Sage, Hinata, the Children, Rigurd, and Geld, and I'm sure there's also many more really obvious characters I'm forgetting, but you get the point. Oh, and there's also Milim, a ridiculously overpowered 20,000-year-old Demon Lord, and she's my favourite behind Rimuru, closely followed by Great Sage. The sound design in the show stands out as being notably great, and it's certainly either my favourite or second favourite, up there with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The episode with Rimuru's transformation and the words of the world listing off all his new sacrificial upgrades is so mesmerising, and has such cool visuals and notably standout sound design that makes it such a unique and amazing sequence. So the show was already a 10 when there was only one season, and in my opinion, season 2 was even better. I have a canvas of the season 2 Megiddo moment on my wall because I thought it was just so damn cool. Season 2 opening 2 is fantastic, comfortably in my top 10 OPs of all time. But I have very passionate thoughts on the second version of this opening. As the season went on, they eventually replaced sections of the OP that were static with more dynamic elements and animated sections, probably due to getting more time to work on it. And it's just worse. More animation does not make something better by default. A static image with interesting art, framing, and cinematography can be way better than a bland, out-of-place action piece with the best animation you've ever seen. It's a minor nitpick, but it's something that really got me fired up. One day I'm definitely going to make a video about this concept of good animation not being synonymous with the term good anime, so look forward to that, I guess. So overall, that time I got reincarnated as a slime is an absolute blast to watch. To me, fun is the perfect word to describe it. It's one of very few 10 out of 10s, and I'd recommend it to anyone. A high school student runs into a girl dressed as a bunny, and seems to be the only person in the world who can see her. Rascal does not dream of Bunny Girl Senpai, follows this boy as he runs into a few people suffering from similar conditions. This is a short 13 episode anime which I honestly don't remember too much about, but I do remember liking it quite a bit. From what I remember, the story is about helping people overcome difficult, stressful things associated with growing up, and from what I remember, it addressed those situations pretty well. I honestly don't have too much to say beyond that. I don't remember the main character's name, or really any character's name besides the bunny girl Mai, but I remember liking the main character quite a bit. There's one scene where he kicks a bully and roasts himself by calling himself a virgin, and out of context that probably sounds strange, but I remember thinking that he did a really sweet thing. He also embarrassed himself by yelling at an entire school of students, and if you've seen the anime, you know exactly the really touching scene I'm talking about. So there's definitely some great character stuff in the show, but unfortunately that's about all I can remember. But there are two things that really stand out from the show, and that's the OP and the ED. They're both great. But the ED in particular is something I've listened to many times. There's this great version where the voice actors for all the main girls from the show sing different parts of the ED, and it's great. Oh, and I know there's a movie, but I haven't seen it. It's been on my list for a long time. At this point, I'd probably want to rewatch the show first, I think. But anyway, from the vague memories I have, Bunny Girl Senpai was a decently good anime. It was really short, so if you're looking for a short and sweet, character-based slice-of-life story, go check it out.